Yes, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to you. This is panel number 2, entitled Russia, Ukraine and Germany's New Era of Military Engagement, Domestic Attitudes, Regional Reactions, NATO Responses. My name is Andris Banka. I'm a senior researcher at IFZO in the University of Greifswald, and I have the pleasure to chairing this session. I think the previous lecture and the panel as well already set things up nicely for us, so no need to repeat things. But I think it's, to set the conversation off, I think it's fair to say that Russian full-scale attack on February 2022 shattered many long-standing assumptions and the security order that existed. One senior German diplomat, I think, put it very nicely when he said European security architecture is no longer organized with Russia, but against Russia. But what do the average German thinks of this assumption? Where do the views between the Baltic states and Germany still diverge? Well, we have just the right people to answer these and other questions. We have a wealth of expertise on this panel that I can assure of. One organizational note that I have to make is that sadly General Thorsten Gersdorf was not able to join us due to an illness, but that means we have slightly more time left for discussion. I know you are all highly accomplished people here on the panel. I know you have stories to tell, but I am also under strict instructions to run a tight ship of 8 to 10 minutes of remarks, and I'll try to stick to that. That being said, let me introduce the first speaker, Dr. Timo Graf. He is Scientific Senior Counselor, Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the Bundeswehr, and he will offer us remarks with the title From Nord Stream to NATO's Eastern Flank, how the Russian-Ukrainian war has or not changed Germany's strategic culture and NATO alliance solidarity. Dr. Graf, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to address you today. The Germans, my people, they are a rather fearful bunch, and I must admit I am no exception. I actually counted, I have 12 insurances, including, yes, believe it or not, 12 insurances, including additional dental insurances for myself, my wife, my 2 children, and, believe it or not, even for my dog. It was a €1 a month optional extra, but it still counts, I believe. So this anecdotal evidence is actually borne out by decades of research by rather famous cultural anthropologist and also social psychologist Gerd Hofstede, who finds that the Germans are among the people with the highest levels of uncertainty avoidance and risk aversion. So for 35 years, Germany's NATO membership was the ultimate insurance against an attack from the Soviet Union. Clearly, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the Germans, like many other European people, were no longer willing to pay high insurance premiums for defense. Rather, they decided to enjoy what has been called the peace dividend. And henceforth, Germany pursued a foreign and security policy as a Zivilmacht. We've heard the term already, as a civilian power, radically reducing its military personnel, its defense budget, and also rather famous sociologist Herfried Münkler. He argued, he made the case several times, also recently, that the Germans had become a post-heroic society, largely pacifist society. And in line with that self-image and that threat assessment, the Germans set out to establish good, friendly relations and also expand its business with Russia. We've heard that today. Various German governments, from Kohl over Schröder to Merkel, they pursued a Russia policy of change through exchange, Wandel durch Handel. Various motives. for the different governments, but quite some continuity. And so the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 did not really upset Germany's bilateral relations with Russia that much. We have to admit that. From a German point of view, it was like addressing the conflict in Ukraine, it was absolutely sufficient to have the Minsk agreements. And also the greater need by the Baltic partners for military reassurance in the context of NATO was, from a German point of view, adequately met with NATO's enhanced forward presence, which was really only to serve as a tripwire in case of a Russian attack. But neither was the German defense budget increased, nor was alliance defense in Europe really made a military strategic priority, as the vast bulk of Germany's military resources continued to be tied up in places like Afghanistan and Mali. And warnings from our Baltic partners, also from our Polish partners, about the imminent threat from Russia, military threat from Russia, continued to be ignored, and business with Russia continued as usual. That much we have heard already, but I need that to set the stage. It really took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to have the Germans wake up. I'm not saying they're fully awake, but to wake up. And this event forced a historic shift in Germany's defense policy, a Zeitenwende, as we call it now in the debate. And it consists of three pillars, really. The first one being the recognition that Russia is now the greatest threat to our security. Because of that, the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, returned to alliance defense in Europe as their main tasks. No more stabilization missions in the south unless there is a real need for it, like against the Houthis. And thirdly, these new commitments to alliance defense in Europe, they are underpinned by an increase in our defense budget. Bear in mind, not our regular defense budget, but it all comes from those extra 100 billion, which will be spent rather quickly. So these are the pillars of the Zeitenwende, and my research really focuses on how people in Germany make sense of this Zeitenwende in defense policy, and whether or not the Germans allegedly being pacifists, if and how and why something changes in their strategic culture. I conduct this research on behalf of the Ministry of Defense, and what I'm about to show you is proprietary data from our own surveys, representative population surveys. And at first, this graph can be a little bit overwhelming, I will admit that, and my boss warned me, don't put too much information in there, but it tells a rather simple story. You have 4 lines here that do not really move over time, and you have 3 lines that do move a fair bit, and there's a jump since 2022. Okay, so what does this chart tell us? It tells us that there's a Zeitenwende in public opinion on German defense policy. What the government is currently doing or trying to do, or announcing at least, finds the support of a majority of Germans. There's greater support for the defense of NATO's eastern flank. There's greater support for an increase in national defense spending. And now a majority of Germans recognizes, we were told otherwise today, but a majority of Germans recognizes Russia as a threat to Germany's security. What doesn't move is Germany's strategic culture, the percentages of pacifists, of realists way up there, isolationists and militarists at the very bottom. They didn't change. There is no tectonic shift, as it were, in Germany's strategic culture with regards to the people. And perhaps that was not even necessary, because the majority of Germans, maybe I go back, the majority of Germans, when you take a look at this, they haven't been pacifists. And Ukraine didn't change much about that. The majority of Germans have been realists. That is, they embrace all means to pursue Germany's foreign security and defense policy. All means. And the exact mix of those means very much depends on the context. And right now in Ukraine, they are more than willing to support military means to address that situation. That we need to keep in mind. Another thing is the left wing in Germany has been crying remilitarization. I put that question mark on the previous slide. I see no evidence of that, despite the change in policy attitudes. I see no change in that because the number of militarists remains negligible in Germany, absolutely. So and perhaps you have noticed that the three indicators of policy attitudes, right, they move in parallel. They move in parallel. They seem to share a rather intimate relationship. And we had a look at that relationship in more depth. And we published the findings, I'm not ashamed to advertise that here, in the journal Contemporary Security Policy in December 2023. And really the key finding is that, especially the increase in NATO alliance solidarity, and that means with our Baltic partners in particular, is driven by a shift in the threat perception, both at the aggregate level and at the individual level of our respondents. The more Germans come to see Russia as a threat to their own security, the more willing they are to support Germany's military contributions to the defense of NATO's eastern flank. So there's no altruism here. It's just that from a German point of view, NATO as an insurance policy starts to make sense again. And you could interpret this as evidence of a rational public. Maybe, but it's certainly no evidence of a strategic public. Strategic thinking is the hallmark of responsible leadership, but the people have nothing to do with that. And if threat perceptions are the driver of this change, I must warn you, they are volatile. They do change literally overnight. And so it's absolutely important that we communicate on all levels that Russia will remain the biggest threat to our security, regardless of what is happening on the front lines in Ukraine. To have an analogy, we do not alter our strategic response to global climate change based on the weather forecast. We don't do that either. There are a couple of other points to be made, but the one I do want to make is the last one. German military leadership should not be expected. We were asked by a review of our paper to include trust in the US as a NATO ally, as a control variable. Turns out it's the second most important predictor of alliance solidarity. They have a positive, strong relationship, meaning the more people trust the US to remain committed to defense in Europe, the more willing they are to do on their own. But that positive relationship also means that if people lack trust in the US, don't expect them and don't expect Germany to take the US's place. That is not likely to happen. I'm on my final words here, and I would like to conclude with words of President Roosevelt in his 1933 inaugural speech. He asserted, I quote, his firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Based on my insights, I would like to rephrase that quote and assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is the lack of fear itself, unjustified, naive, and wishful thinking, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. And along these lines, our Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, recently told us that we can only avert disaster by clearly facing the threat ahead of us. And so we were told to prepare for war with Russia by 2029 at the latest. Both mentally and physically, we should get ready. Right, and really the only insurance that we have against an attack from Russia is an effective deterrence by NATO. And if Russia escalates the risk of a direct confrontation, then we need to accept higher insurance premiums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graf. Intriguing polling and a very useful reminder to take out insurance. Next up, we have Ambassador Mayra Mora, who was a Director General of the Council of the Baltic Sea States from 2016 to 2020, and head of the EU delegation to Belarus 2011-2015. She has a presentation with a very catchy title, Hannibal ad Portas, Vantage Points, Losses and Benefits. Ambassador Mora, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I told already, to think up, when I was asked to think up a title, that is the hardest part of all the presentation. To start with, I'm one more, after Ambassador Schlager, practitioner. And I would like to start by reminiscing two episodes during my career. When I was EU ambassador in Belarus, we had a regional meeting in Moscow, organized by EU ambassador in Moscow. And as usually it takes place at such meetings, there were presentations by all kinds of Russian branch ministries and agencies coming to our group making presentations. And I already had a sizable diplomatic career behind my back. I've never seen such arrogance, such self-assurance as I saw from these mid and, we are quite senior level civil servants from different kinds of Russian ministries. That was back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, or 13, before 2014 invasion of Crimea. It was as if saying, yes, you are there, but we kind of don't need you. We are ourselves very strong, very impressive. The next episode was, of course, after 2014, Russia was kicked out of G7 and in many organizations its participation was suspended, but Council of Baltic Sea States was the one organization, although at that time it had already reached its stated goals when it was established. By and large, it was kept as an organization where there is Russia at the table, and Russia was sitting at this table quite in a civilian manner and was quite cooperative given the circumstances at that time. So it is, but when after February 24, 2022, Russia was, participation was suspended from our side, but then Russia withdrew from the organization altogether. To get back to the title of my presentation, to speak about Hannibal, some perceived it as a, well, maybe in a sense it is used now as a kind of a scare, mostly against small children, like, oh, the bear will come and take you away. So an empty scare. Some took Hannibal seriously ab initio, said he's dangerous, and then some said that he's dangerous, but others wouldn't listen to them. When the great gates were crashed, and now Hannibal is at our gates. When it happened, some hoped that, and notably Germany, as was mentioned already many times here, that the problem will somehow resolve itself, and that sooner or later Europe and Germany will be back to this quite lucrative business as usual with Russia. Then some really remarkable event happened with others, notably two, one historically, one forcefully neutral countries abandoned their neutrality and joined NATO almost instantly, and increasing the security situation in the Baltic Sea region, notably. And that was a huge gain for this security situation. And still others said, we told you so. Russia has the plan to destroy Ukraine, destabilize West, bend it into compliance. That is the new buzzword in Russia today. I don't know how to bend, translate better this. Assert and strengthen its zones of influence. And I would like to note that Wirtschaftsraum from Lisbon to Vladivostok was already then part of this plan. On our side, we lacked strong unified response, and lack of also strategic, clear stated goals. Should Ukraine win? Should Ukraine lose, cede territory, engage in peace talks? The messages are very, very different, have been very different over time on this. While at the same time, what we really totally lack is the, which is the best scenario, that is the strategic ambiguity, which will really help to push things forward. News from Washington are quite encouraging, the latest news, and notably that there will be more supplies of air defense pieces, artillery pieces, and also ammunition has been coming in big numbers. But productions in Europe should be geared to a wartime military industry, which is not happening at present. And it is difference is not only material and organizational, but maybe also the reason for this is maybe also psychological, because after World War II, so many wise and determined men and women did everything that there won't be any more war in Europe. And this idea that one day you'll have to go to the war, the charts already show that this is simply unacceptable to most of Europeans. Me too, when back there was discussions initiated about European defense capability, I thought, why? We have NATO. This is a waste of resource and purpose. Support for Ukraine is continuing in my country, in other Baltic countries. We are, somebody already mentioned that, some mention in figures, some mention in % of GDP, but 1% of GDP for our countries, it is quite a small sum, but it is a big contribution, taking into account the fact that we have manifold increased spending for our own defense in the given situation. That also costs huge resources. And therefore, we are very grateful for all the NATO contributions, notably now Latvia is hosting air policing and German air Luftwaffe units will be there. They are since March till end of the year, and welcoming also what was mentioned, the Kriegstüchtigkeit that Germany is now reminding, minister is reminding Germans. The mix of imperialist, communist and religious ideas that is now governing Russia I don't foresee any change, not only in my lifetime, because I'm already advanced in age, but also for the next generation. There are, the regime change there can be made only by the Russians themselves. But as I mentioned you in the example in the very beginning, the mood there is not there for this, and these ambitions that I mentioned, they are there and they are now being instilled in the younger generation. It is really very troublesome to see and to observe. If Russia is not defeated, it will go further, and then it will go further to us, probably, God forbid, but they will not stop there, because that is ingrained in their thinking. Also, to remind that missiles in Kaliningrad are not targeted at Riga, Vilnius, or Tallinn. That doesn't mean that they'll be fired. Not in the least, because their best before date maybe already is past. But to bend into compliance, these are powerful tools. And to end, I would like to remember one more event at the beginning of this week, not NATO summit, but earlier. We asked, is there a bottom to savagery? And we got an answer, no, not at all. Keep watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mora, for a very sober and realistic assessment of the neighboring country, Russia. Last but not least, we have another ambassador, Matthias Sohn, who served as a German ambassador to Lithuania from 2019 to 2022, and certainly has first-hand experience with German-Lithuanian relations. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Andris. I hope everybody can hear me well. I come at this subject, welcome, and thank you for being here. I come at this subject from a truly regional perspective, which I think I should lay open in the interest of transparency right from the beginning. My family, half about of my family, are from the region we are here talking about. They come from a city which today is called Kaliningrad, and I think I may, because of that, always have more awareness, inner awareness, even before I had to do with the Baltics professionally, more awareness of sort of their locus in the world. I will start. My subject is the question about the question mark. Of course, the title already says that there is a question mark. Where does this come from? I'll start in 2022, 27th of February, 3 days after the full-on Russian military attack on Ukraine. Federal Chancellor Scholz gave a very clear, not histrionic, very calm, but extremely conceptually clear speech about the situation Europe was now in. We were, as a continent, we Europe, not necessarily we Germany or whatever, we were at war for the first time in many, many years. You can argue about other wars that happened and whatnot, but that was the starting point. And the political conclusions from this truly fundamental new fact on the ground in our continent were laid out in great and sobering, you could also say, clarity. Now, where does the question mark come from? The political leader of Germany laid it out immediately and very clearly. And yet, switching forward a good 2.5 years, right these days, this same German federal government put forward a budget, a draft budget for 2025, which has an increase in military spending which is so minimal that it does not even compensate for inflation losses. And the political mechanisms that lead to this rather enormous difference from the starting point to the difficulties in implementation in everyday life would be something that would require probably great detail. But let us say German politics is always slow. We have already heard this morning in the discussion how many of our Baltic and other European partners, Central and Eastern European partners, always complain about how slow Germany is in really implementing anything. And I can, now that I no longer work for the German government, I am gratefully free to confirm this. The way from concept to reality is very far. Only 2 or 3 points for lack of time. Why can I not describe this in detail? It's just too much. The Federal Chancellor heads a difficult coalition government in which the most relevant hesitation factor, the brake pad, is, however, not one of the other coalition partners, but about half of his own party. And I'm not looking there. Not his problem. About half of his own party. And I will not describe in detail what goes on there. It suffices to note at this point, they are not following his leadership, his initial leadership. And by now, as a citizen of Germany, I find it hard myself to assess how much he himself, the Federal Chancellor, is still convinced that the Zeitenwende and all that he explained that implies and means that the Zeitenwende is what he needs to do. I can no longer vouch for that from my perspective. Different perspectives. We had this subject already. Different perspectives between Lithuanians and Germans in this case. We have no Lithuanians here on the panel, so I thought perhaps a little bit of anecdotal ambassador's experience. When you get to a new country, you always have your eyes particularly wide open and you encounter many new people. One of my first experiences was a total surprise, quite similar to what Christian Schlager described before to us. On a Sunday walk with my wife, I get accosted by a gentleman, middle-aged Lithuanian gentleman. Aren't you the new German ambassador? Yes, they knew that I had been on the television. So, how can I help you? Nothing that you need to help me with. I just wanted to say thank you that you have your troops here. This was, and I think that is not a minority or outlier view in Lithuania, the most important thing about German-Lithuanian relations from the Lithuanian perspective is that we are putting by now more than 1,000 young German women and men in harm's way in order to uphold alliance unity, the principle that in a defense alliance either we all have security or none of us do. That is very important, and it was an eye-opener for me. Perspective, we already had Nord Stream twice or three times. I must admit, to me, even now, the idea of Radek Sikorski that Nord Stream is a kind of Hitler-Stalin pact is honestly profoundly unconvincing, and I find it offensive too. It was never that, and it was never going to be that. And the fact that Putin, by starting a war, has given it retrospective credibility does not say much about its strategic orientation from the start, except, of course, that we Germans have never believed that for Russia, energy is a weapon. Why not? And why is that so different from our Baltic partners, between us and our Baltic partners? We have bought and received Russian gas since the late 1970s, deep Cold War times, deep Soviet times. And our German, West German that is, experience was the Soviet Union and then Russia was always absolutely reliable as a provider of fossil energy fuels. In my embassy in Lithuania, again, an eye-opener in the beginning of my time there, when we discussed this among colleagues, my Lithuanian colleagues, very smart people, fantastic colleagues, described how, when they were at elementary school as 8-year-olds, how they sat in their classroom in school in the winter with their gloves, shawl, hat, and coat on because the school wasn't heated. And that was because after independence, Russia turned off the gas, which then the Baltic states were still completely dependent on. It was the exact opposite historical experience from the one we West Germans had made and which had informed our view of Russia as a supplier of energy, of fossil fuel energy. Nonetheless, the amazing thing is Lithuania has always seen, and I think through the ups and downs, still sees Germany as, in the worst case scenario, it's the lesser evil. It's, of course, by far the lesser evil compared to Russia, and even compared to other immediate neighbors, to many Lithuanians, Germany appears as the more benevolent and less threatening alternative. And that, in turn, I believe, is surprising from a historical perspective. You know, you come to Lithuania as a German with the idea of the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust, 1941 to 1944, and you meet lots and lots of Lithuanians who think that Germany was basically always at least the lesser evil, if not even better. And are we intelligent enough, Germany, politically intelligent enough to make use of this benevolence, of this good disposition, positive disposition? Not always convinced of that. I think time will show that Germany's real activities, in contrast to our often extremely obtuse public political language, the reality of what we're doing, i.e. building a brigade, and not building a new brigade in Germany, but we build the new brigade in Lithuania. And that speaks for itself. A brigade, not all of you may know that, and unfortunately our defense attaché has not come today. I can only say, when I was heading an embassy, the defense attachés were pretty reliable there. Their ambassador made sure of that. This is a big fighting unit, a brigade. And my personal impression, I will conclude with that. My personal impression of the Bundeswehr troops and their integration into the NATO battle group there in Lithuania is, again, a positive surprise. You know, in Germany, we have this view of our own armed forces as basically not very impressive and certainly not warlike and not very convincing on the whole as a military force. And the pacifists are extremely happy with that, and the realists are really worried about that. What I have seen in Lithuania is, honestly, and I can tell, good fighting units. They are really good fighting units. And that may not be typical for the whole Bundeswehr, but it means that the German armed forces have at least some outfits that are convincing fighting forces. And on this, on the whole positive note, I will leave you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zorn, for your frank assessment and insightful sharing your insights with us as well. We have some good 15 minutes for questions from the audience. You should be waiting for a roving microphone, I believe. I think you were the first to raise the hand just now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. So I have a question to Timo Graf concerning your opinion polls. Do you have any information, let's say, on party opinions? So, and with a question, so why is SPD not following the graph you are showing and not supporting or accepting this rise in the awareness of Russia, but rather focusing on freezing the conflict as Mützenich tried to do it?
Let's maybe collect two more questions. Yes, two of you, I think, closely sitting, you can ask. Both of you, yeah.
Viktor Dovichenko, thank you so much for fantastic comments. A very practical question, if I may. We are talking about defense spending, but there is also defense procurement. And this is what we say defense companies are taking care of that. There is a kind of a vicious circle going on here, because defense companies are claiming since 2022 they don't have insurances enough, because they don't have demands from their government, sometimes we are talking about, to boost their expand their production lines. So what we have is a kind of political elites of some of the countries. They are saying they are boosting. Companies say, sorry, we don't receive enough of the orders, or we can't do that. How to break this vicious circle, which is very practical when we're thinking not only in terms of 2024, but 2025, especially after US elections. Thank you.
And whom you are addressing this question?
To all of the panel, whoever it takes.
Thank you. Thank you. Robert Clark, Senior Defence Fellow at Civitas and Policy Director at Chamber UK. It's just a quick observation. The first presentation, the slides were fascinating regarding the German public opinion perception regarding increased militarisation. The final one of those was, to me, the most intriguing, which was there was no expectation for an increase in German military leadership in Europe. And the question to that is, obviously, if we have a potentially highly likely return to Washington of an administration, and in particular the National Security Advisor in Bridge Colby, that will see a large withdrawal potentially of the US military leadership in Europe. How does Germany see, particularly in the Bundeswehr and the political elite, a gap for that to fill? And if the lack of will is there, is that either through military capability, which I somehow doubt, owing to the ambassador's previous presentation regarding the capability of the Bundeswehr in Lithuania, which I've had the privilege in the British Army to serve alongside with, or is it more political investment and political will not to increase like military leadership in Europe, if that comes to pass? Thank you.
Yep. Any responses?
Okay, then we just take them in order. Of course, we can analyze our data also by party, not affiliation, but by voting preference of those whom we survey. And what you see is that all of the points on the slides, they are like in terms of defense policy, like the increase in defense spending, the threat perception of Russia, and also NATO alliance solidarity. You don't see that many differences across the democratic parties, that is, right? And I don't know why the SPD leadership sometimes walks off on a different path than its voter basis. That I don't know. Perhaps you have some insights there, Ambassador. But the point is that we do have...
But we do have an SPD politician with us.
Yeah, but it's a bit frustrating to see how the Minister of Defense is making rather ambitious proposals, and from my point of view, absolutely right choices that he's making or wishes to make, and he doesn't come through in his own party. So either way, but there are open saboteurs of public opinion. That is the far right AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and also the neo-communist Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. And I was hoping, because they're very similar in terms of their mindset, they're anti-American, they're anti-NATO, they're anti-globalization, the left and the right, right? I thought that this new Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, the neo-communists, they would take away voters from the far right, but that does not appear to happen. They are very good at motivating former non-voters, and that means that the neo-communists are not taking away votes from the right wing, but you have a larger front of saboteurs. And I think that is very worrying, especially when you take a look at the elections in Eastern Germany, the upcoming ones, because the projections are horrendous, right, from a democratic point of view. Right.
Any other responses to the questions?
Well, about the armaments industry and this mutual, pointing at each other. The government says, ooh, they're not producing anymore. And the industries are pointing at the government, saying, but you haven't given us orders. This is, of course, a typical phenomenon in all democracies. People do try to avoid taking responsibility. And let me just point out one thing. After the 24th of February 2022, we had for another 10 months, or 11 even after that, a defense minister in office, a German defense minister in office, who refused to meet with anyone from the armaments industry. She thought, honestly, I don't know why. I'm not going to try and explain any rationale behind that. Now we have Minister Pistorius, who will do everything necessary, in the Mario Draghi sense, whatever it takes to get everything going as much as he can, including talking to people from the armaments industry. Again, cultural change takes time, and of course the industrialists are trying to blackmail the political spectrum, knowing that we now depend on them so very badly, Ukraine most of all, but all of us really, because we're depleting our stocks altogether. They are trying to minimize their entrepreneurial risk, basically asking for a 10-year advance guarantee in order to even lift a finger. which, again, an issue of dependence, I suppose.
There was a question right there.
I wanted to respond to the military leadership question regarding Germany in case there will be another Trump presidency. My insights tell me the following. The Germans are capable and they would be willing to do more for alliance defense if somebody walks with them, is taking their hand, right? The Germans are not natural born leaders when it comes to questions of war and peace, and history tells us if we do make sovereign decisions in that area, it ends very badly. So one conclusion of that experience is never alone. No more war, never alone. And this never alone part, this multilateralism, this is so ingrained in German strategic culture that I believe other people will have to do. That if the US are no longer taking Germany by the hand, then others will have to push and shove and pull Germany in the right direction. And by that I mean countries who are, well, from an objective point of view, who are small, you might say. But even the smallest countries, right, they can do their part in pushing the sleeping giant Germany in the right direction, right? And you can see that with the ammunitions initiative by the Czech, for instance, you know, that kind of creativity, that is required by everyone, right? And the Polish bullying Germany in the public so much that we're not doing enough, even at times when we're already doing more than the Polish. But they would keep up the pressure, right? Pushing us in the right direction, right? I think we need more of that from all European partners who believe that this regime in Russia is the greatest threat and deserves to be defeated.
There was one question there, I promised, and here as well, gentlemen.
Yes, thank you so much. As you have already, I will identify myself. I'm sorry, Karolina Wigura, from Berlin and from Warsaw. So as you have already noticed, I'm very interested in notions. So I was interested in what Zeitenwende means and what defeat means in history. And now I'm interested what it means to be offensive, because I can see a very interesting tension in the panel between one panelist who is saying that other countries should push Germany in the right direction, and the other panelist who says that some utterances and arguments might be insultive or offensive. And of course we can have a discussion about who offended whom, right? And not only Germany is really to be pointed out here. There is this lovely anecdote about 2008 and Polish and the Baltic states' presidents going to Georgia, to Tbilisi, and asking Nicolas Sarkozy for a meeting, and Sarkozy answering to Lech Kaczynski, late Lech Kaczynski, I will meet you, but not little ones. So meaning the Baltic states' presidents. So you know, we can of course discuss who insulted or offended whom, but I do believe that then we will not go anywhere. It doesn't bring a positive effect. Something that is said in a radicalized way may also bring an important information, and we simply have to decide whether we treat it as an insult or offensive statement, or we rather derive knowledge from it. So my question is actually, taking on this note that you might push the sleeping public opinion into some good direction, or you might learn about what is right about Putin's Russia. How can we make sure that this mutual learning takes place rather than concentrate on who was more offensive to whom?
There was another question here. So.
Thank you. Benjamin Tallis from German Council on Foreign Relations. Just actually picking up on that and relating it to a couple of the remarks of the panel. Back in 2022, we wrote a piece saying that really irritated Olaf Scholz, that said Germany's moving at the speed of shame. And this pissed him off personally, and I can understand why. But our point in making this was to say you have created a dynamic by where you are only moving when you are shamed by allies from outside. So the shaming will continue until policy improves. And this is the tragedy of the situation, of the wasted effort of the Zeitenwende and the raised expectations of the Zeitenwende, which were not then delivered on, because it then takes the kind of pressure that Timo Graf was just referring to now from the Poles, from the Balts, from others to stand up publicly and say you need to do more, as Tusk did about common European defence spending very recently. So there's an issue there, indeed, of what Carolina said about do we take it as an insult or do we take it as information. But the move in Berlin, particularly from the trio at the top of the Chancellery, Scholz, Schmidt and Plötner, has been to bunker down and say to everyone, we don't respond well to criticism. I mean, that's convenient as a way of doing it. It's coming. The question is coming. But this is to sort of to say, how do you break that dynamic? Well, one is not to assume that everyone's waiting for Germany. It was mentioned, others are actually doing more and moving faster. So what is Germany's role here and how does it support? What is that role Germany can take? But the question to Timo very quickly, because I found it so interesting what you said, I think we have to think of fear as not being monolithic or uniform, because I think there is fear, but it's a different fear than the one you're talking about. It's not fear of war, it's fear of having your standard of living messed with. It's fear of losing something, it's fear of change. And those two fears are in combination, so I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Right. Let me just throw in the last question from myself, abusing the chair. I have heard in this conference lots of nice things heard about the Baltic countries. And coming from a Baltic country, that sounds very nice to me, how wise we have been and so on and so forth, how Germany is slow. I want to flip the table around a bit. In the Baltics, we have clamored for permanent troop presence, permanent bases and so on and so forth for decades. Now we have found the dog has caught the bus. Now we have the German presence, but turns out in Lithuania the infrastructure is not there to support it. How, from your experience as an ambassador, Lithuania as a host country has managed to build these things up, because suddenly turns out we need high schools, kindergartens to accommodate German presence. What is your perspective on the host nation of Lithuania and how able they have been and fast to adapt to this thing?
Thank you for that question. I am actually a first-hand observer of this development. And I can say the Lithuanians, certainly their foreign minister and leader of the Conservative Party, clearly sees it as a success of Lithuanian bullying that Germany has now decided about a year ago to permanently station not only the soldiers of the brigade, but also all the stuff that you mentioned, the families, the everything that comes with a fully stationed military outfit. And they would definitely say, well, Germany would never have done that had we not bullied them enough. My own perception is pretty radically different, and I have said that a lot of times in my last few weeks in Lithuania. I've said, careful guys, it is true that Germany is often slow and that Germany sometimes needs a little persuasion to get going on something. But if you think that in a strategically important issue like this one, do we want a brigade in Lithuania with families, with everything that a garrison has, or do we just want the soldiers there and their equipment? Don't believe that that kind of decision would be brought about just by a little bit of political bullying. But it was a very interesting debate. How much bullying does Germany need in order to do the right thing? The true part about it is certainly that Germany has great difficulties doing the right thing just because it has understood the right thing. That is true. A little bit of pressure does help.
Right, other responses?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the remarks regarding the fears of the Germans. So the war in Ukraine and everything that's related, I would say is on number 3 of the top fears and threats that the Germans identify. Number 1 is actually inflation, rising prices. And the second one is migration. And number 3 is the war in Ukraine and tensions with Russia. I think that our government hasn't done a very good job in communicating the fact that we have 1.3 million Ukrainian refugees in Germany because of the war, because of Putin. We have or had such high inflation in Germany because of Putin's war, right? Instead, the public perception is that we have high inflation and we have all these migrants because it's government policy by the Greens, by the SPD, very, very open to the idea of taking in more refugees, coming up with laws that make energy ever more expensive in Germany, right? And so I think the government would have been and still is well advised if they were to tell people that the war in Ukraine is not just some abstract thing about security and freedom, but it actually hits your wallet. You pay the price of Putin's war every day. And when you're upset by refugees, it's Putin who's making these people move, right? So, and that these connections, they haven't been communicated properly. And so the impression is that migration and inflation, we blame on the government. And the war in Ukraine is rather abstract about security and freedom, etc. But the obvious links between these 3 issues, they're not properly communicated.
I'm looking at the organizers. Are we cutting into buffet time with one last question? I think yes, even 2. There was gentleman right here, ambassador, and then one more, if very short one. No statements, please.
On the issue of armaments industry and German government, just a clarification in addition to that. German industry is by law prohibited to produce any kind of heavy arms on their own decision. They have to have a decision by government. Before that is not the case, they're not allowed to produce. So they cannot go just for on their own. They have to wait for the German government to move.
Thank you for that clarification. And one last question was here.
In May, the Russian Defense Ministry decided to dispute the placement of navigation buoys on the Narva River, which forms the border with Estonia. Does that create concern about Russian intentions? There's also a redrafting of baselines around Russian islands in the Baltic Sea. And does that bring it closer to home for the Germans?
Thank you. Nina Kuriata, Totus Media. I've heard, as you said, that if the US abandons Germany, then Germany would not lead the European security itself, but Trump's allies, especially his security architect, Elbridge Colby, said recently that we will not break our spear in Europe. Germany would defeat Russia itself if he only wanted, and it's time to pay your price. Guys, wake up. So how, in the perspective that the US will draw their attention to China and less attention to NATO as a European security provider, how are you going to persuade those people who, on your graph, went down since 2022 in terms of Russia is a threat, no, it's going down, NATO is an important alliance, it's going down, how are you going to deal with that? Because otherwise, as again one of you said, there will be the war with Russia in Europe and you will be left at Russia's mercy, and we don't know where will be Ukraine, and if not, Ukrainian men will be recruited to, if Ukrainian men won't be recruited to Russia's army by that time. Thank you.
Thank you. If possible, 30-second responses or something of that nature.
Honestly, not broadly taken notice of in Germany. Of course it was in the news. Of course it was even in the television news. And people sort of realized it and thought, well, Russian antics, they're always dicking us around. And they're always testing particularly their smaller partner, the neighboring countries, just by way of prodding and dicking us around and see what the reaction is. I think beyond that, no profound German perception on this.
If I may agree, it's petty harassment that Russia has been doing constantly all the time. Before Ukraine war, and will, if allowed, will continue doing.
Well, I presented to you as a last data point 2023. I can tell you for 2024, because I have that data already, all of those indicators are moving up again, largely because the threat perception is shifting, right? We got to contextualize the data a little bit. 2023, we did the survey in summer, after more than a year of the war, with the recognition that the Russians are not actually that powerful as we thought they'd be, with the Ukrainians having pushed back the Russian forces a fair bit around Kharkiv, Kiev, etc., right? That came as a surprise. And also with the summer offensive of the Ukrainians, sort of on the move, right? And there were high expectations riding on this offensive, right? So the impression amongst the Germans was that, actually, Ukraine might win this war, right? With the little help that we give it. Super crazy idea, but still, somehow that was the impression at the time. Comes 2024 and the recognition that the offensive didn't do that much. The Russians go all in with their war economy. They're willing to lose 1,500 soldiers a day easily. Have no problems whatsoever with those losses. And now the realization is we are being threatened. Ukraine is not winning, right? And all these indicators are moving up again. That's why I'm saying if the threat perception is the key driver of the Zeitenwende in people's heads, we shouldn't look at the front line in Ukraine. There needs to be a consensus that beyond Ukraine, this Russia will remain our problem and our threat.
Thank you very much for that. Let's thank our esteemed speakers, and I believe the buffet awaits us as well. Thank you very much.